welcome those who might be watching this online. So thank you again for the privilege of your time, all of you, as we are in our series in the book of Proverbs. We're in message number 4. We're talking about generosity today. And I struggle with generosity, namely because I don't know exactly if my giving is going to really actually help somebody or not. I think I'm a pretty generous person. I'm pretty willing to help people in whatever means that I can. I'll loan tools. I'll loan people my truck even. And yet there is this struggle within me that if I help somebody, am I really helping them? And I read this article in Christianity Today magazine recently that says, not all helping helps. You can give in an ineffective way, which you give to circumstances or to people who you help them in an immediate need, but you don't help them over the long haul. There's no transformation that helps. Or you can actually hurt somebody by giving. You can create a dependency, a dysfunction, and you can rob them of their dignity. So giving can harm as well. And so I struggle with how to appropriately give what God has given me to other persons or other programs or companies or ministries that actually are going to help transform human lives and retain their dignity. And so here am I studying all about generosity this week, and on Thursday we get a guy that comes into the office, and he is upset because he has been to church after church after church, and nobody is helping him like he wants to be helped. And so Mary calls me out, and I talk to him for about 30 minutes, and I pray with him, and I end up giving him some cash, which is one of our policies. We don't give out cash, but I did. And so he went on his way because he wanted a suit to wear to an interview, and he needed gas money, and that's the story. And so I sent him to Atlas. Well, on Saturday, I happened to go to Atlas thrift store and drop off some things that I was donating. And Scott, the owner, was there, my good friend. And I said, Scott, did this guy come by and ask you for a suit? And he said, yeah. And I showed him the suits that I had, and I don't know that he picked one. But he told me, he said, you need to be careful of this guy because he has a reputation already for going around from church to church to church. And if you don't give him what he wants in the way he wants it, he will threaten your life. He's a psychopath. Be careful if he comes back. I'm going, oh, great. I don't know if I did the right thing or not by giving him cash or not, but that's the kind of conflict we get in. If we give and are generous to somebody, is it really helping or not? So I don't know what your struggle is with generosity. I have met in churches, and I've served several churches, the most sincere, kind-hearted and compassionate and generous people in the world. I do believe that the Christian church is where a ton of truly generous people reside. In fact, I've read that the average church person doesn't just give to their church, but up to 6 other good causes. I mean, church people are extraordinarily generous, I believe, for the most part. Having said that, we do live in a consumer culture where we are taught to get all you can, get the freebies that you can, and hang on to all that you can. And so there's another statistic that comes out that on average in any particular church, name it, about 20% of the people who attend do not have any record of financial giving in that church. That's just across America. That is the statistic. And so that spirit of consumerism comes to church. I'm here to take. I'm here to consume religious services, but not then to give. It is the mission of Jesus, people, to turn consumers into servants. It is the mission of Jesus to take takers and turn them into generous givers. That is one of the missions of Jesus. Now, speaking of a church that was struggling, there was this pastor whose offerings weren't all that great, and so he had this idea that he would generate a little more income at the offering time. He says, whoever gives the most in today's offering will get to pick 3 hymns to sing. How about that? And so the collection plate goes down the aisles and comes back, and right on the top of the plate is a $100 bill. And he holds that up. Man, somebody in here has been really generous today, and this is the person who gets to pick 3 hymns. And so who is it that came in? This little old lady, she's out there, she raises her hand, and she comes tottering down the front aisle, and she's out there and says, ma'am, you are generous, and you get, the reward is that you get to pick 3 hymns. And so she turns around and she gives a good, careful look at the whole congregation, and she says, I'll pick him, and I'll pick him, and I'll pick him. So those are just kind of lame ways to motivate people in church. But God knows the motivation of our hearts. He does. And the idea that I have heard, well, I can't afford to give, Pastor, because I just don't have it to give. I don't have enough to give. I got to pay my bills, so there's none left over at all for me to give. Well, that's the introduction. Let's look at what the book of Proverbs has to teach us about the subject of generosity. And I have to remind you that, again, the original audience for this book, in the first chapter, it tells us these are to young men, particularly, because men only got educations at that particular time. So these are young men, but not just any young men. They were young men from royal or affluent families. So this is like the men coming from the haves, okay? They were families of wealth, and they didn't grow up poor. They didn't grow up as the have-nots. And so these boys, these young teenagers, are going to be taught how to manage their wealth. They're going to inherit it. They're going to go into positions in the kingdom that they will probably be more income leveled than anybody else. Now, there are over 100 verses in the book of Proverbs on money. 100 verses. And a lot of them are found in chapters 10 through 22. There are 375 verses there attributed to King Solomon. He also is attributed to most of the chapters between 1 and 10. So here's what's intriguing. You have rich boys, teenagers, being taught how to manage money from one of the wealthiest kings the world has ever seen, King Solomon. And that would make sense, wouldn't it? That makes sense to me. A wealthy king, his words, his wisdom about money being transferred to these young students who are going to become functionaries in the government. So let's just give you a quick sample. Again, there are so many verses, but he starts off in chapter 3, verse 9, honor God, young men, with your wealth by giving first to him. Always makes that priority. He says character and reputation are more important than great riches because you can lose money and regain it quite quickly. But you lose your character, you lose your reputation, and it's going to really be difficult to regain over time. Honest, hard work will bring financial prosperity. Big statement on hard work in this passage. Greed can ruin relationships, as you well know. Money properly used has a great potential for good. And of course, 22:7, the borrower is slave to the lender. So which one are you going to be? Which one are you going to be? So as I said, there's 100 random sayings. As I'm studying these verses, I'm reading them, and I'm saying, God, I am overwhelmed. 100. How do I preach on 100 verses? I can't. I shouldn't. So Lord, what is it? Out of all of these 100 of verses, where's the focus that you want me to bring on this Sunday? And I really wrestled with that. And I finally came and landed on this passage in chapter 11. Chapter 11, 24 through 26 is the focus of today's message. So let's read it together. Will you join me? One person gives freely, yet gains even more. Another withholds unduly, but comes to poverty. A generous person will prosper, and whoever refreshes others will be refreshed. People curse the one who hoards, but they pray God's blessing on the one who is willing to sell. So let's just look at these words today again as they are addressed to these young, affluent teenagers, but also to us as affluent Americans. And if you look at the global economy, we are affluent people. We cannot get out of that label. We live in America, and we have a lifestyle that is way beyond most of the world. Let's start with the negative part of this proverb served. Verse 24b. A person withholds unduly and comes to poverty. To hold unduly, King Solomon is using a word that means to hang on to grasp tightly, to maintain very strict control over your goods and resources, more than he ought to. And he says that person is really headed toward the road to poverty. I understand in third world countries that they have figured out how to catch monkeys without a tranquilizer dart or any kind of a trap. They simply take a coconut or a gourd, they hollow it out, they put a small hole in the top of it, big enough for the monkey's hand to go into, and they attach that gourd to something fixed, a stake or a tree or something immovable. And so they leave it alone, and the monkey comes along, and he reaches down there and grabs the handful of rice really tightly. The monkey realizes that it cannot take its hand out of that gourd, out of that hole. If he would release it, he would escape quite easily. But he will not. And he will stay there with his handful of rice and be captured before he will let loose of that. That's the kind of grip Solomon is talking about here. He says, if you hang on like that to what you have, it will take you to poverty. Verse 26, people curse the one who hoards. If you ever watched the TV show Hoarders, you have been shocked in disbelief. And you say, how can somebody do that? And I've only watched that a couple times. My favorite show for many seasons was American Pickers. When I had cable TV, I don't have it anymore. And I'll never forget the one time where I just, something changed in me that I said, I just don't want to watch this show anymore, because these two guys, came to this farm, and there's this huge barn, and it is full of old good stuff, right? And here's the old guy that comes out, and he owns this barn full of stuff. You've seen it. I mean, he's old. As I said, he's got one foot on a banana peel and the other in the grave. And he is not willing to part with like two things out of this whole thing. Like, really? And it's a sickness, and I just got tired of seeing that kind of sickness, and I just lost interest in that show, not because of the picker guys, it's because of the people that they met. Ugh, that is illness. And yet, when we look at it, we have to own the fact that we all have that tendency. We are hoarders by nature because we have a selfish nature. We are born selfish, and we are trained by our culture to feed that selfishness, to get all you can and to keep all you can by every means. Just like Jesus told the story in Luke 12 of the man who was prosperous, and he kept building barns to store it all. And he built bigger barns, and he built more barns. And finally one day he says, man, I think I have enough to retire. I'm going to sit and relax and eat, drink, and be merry. That's where that phrase comes from. And that night he dies. Where does it all go to? Who knows? But he didn't get to enjoy it. That's the way we are. That's our tendency, is to hang on to what we have. King Solomon's telling these rich boys, selfishness will lead to poverty. Selfishness will lead to poverty. And in 28:22 it says it directly. The stingy are eager to get rich and are unaware that poverty awaits them. And so, young men, if you want to avoid the path that leads to poverty, then you must learn to go against your selfish human nature. You must go against your innate drive for self-preservation and instead determine to become a generous giver. Let's look at the positive part of the proverb. One person gives freely, yet gains even more. It's a word picture, to give freely. It is the ancient farmer with a bag of seed, and he's out there in the field, and he's just going whoosh, whoosh, just freely casting the seed out on the soil, just in an almost reckless way, and not really paying all that much attention to where it lands. It's a picture of snow falling. It's a picture of rain coming down. It's just everywhere. It's going everywhere. This is the idea here. It is a person who is paying little attention. It's just being generous. And that spirit is in direct conflict, as I said, to our selfish human nature and our concept of self-preservation. And plus, it doesn't make mathematical sense. If I have $4 and I give you $2, then I only have 2 left, right? How does this promise come true? How is it that one who gives so freely, so with abandon, will gain? That mathematically, that doesn't work. If I give, I should have less, right? No. Let's understand that. Well, how does this proverb come to truth? How is it that I can give and gain more? How does that work? How does that work? So let's look at some verses that will lead us to that answer. Proverbs 22:9. He who has a generous eye will be blessed, for he gives of his bread to the poor. Proverbs 14:21. Blessed are those who help the poor. Proverbs 14:31. Helping the poor honors God. And then Proverbs 3. Do not withhold good from those who deserve it. Do not say to your neighbor, come back later, I'll give it tomorrow. So these boys, these teens who are the haves of their society, the word is that in the course of their life, they will meet plenty of people, neighbors who have legitimate needs, and they are to do something about that. These are persons who are not con artists. These are persons who are not lazy, able but not willing. They are people who have legitimate needs. The word poor, they will run into poor. It is in Proverbs that Jesus quotes, the poor you will have with you always. And so this is the Hebrew word is dow. These are people who have very limited financial resources. They lack food, clothing, and shelter. And the haves of society are to open their eyes and to open their hearts and to open their wallets and meet legitimate needs as they come across them. Then the promise in 11:25. If you're that kind of a person, you will prosper, because whoever refreshes others will be refreshed. So here's another word picture. Palestine is a very arid climate, right? So what is the most refreshing drink that could possibly be in that particular time? Is simply pure, clean water. And it was a premium. It was a wonderful resource. And so here's the idea here is that for water to be refreshing and fresh, the pool that you get it from has to have an outflow and an inflow. We all know how the Dead Sea got to be called the Dead Sea, right? It has inflow but no outflow. So it's salty, it's brackish, it's disgusting. You wouldn't want to drink it because it's lacking it's got the inflow but not the outflow. And so if the Proverbs is, if we want to be a person that is blessed and refreshing, then there needs to be an outflow and an inflow. Where does the inflow come from? That's the question. If I give, if I'm a generous person, where's the gain going to come from? Here it is in 19:17. If you help the poor, you are lending to the Lord, and the Lord will repay you. There's the answer. Where's the inflow going to come from? As you give, who is going to replace that? It is the Lord. To be generous, you have to believe in God. Believe me. Because it is God who is taking the responsibility to repay you. Giving to those in need, whether it's an organization that helps the needy or a needy person personally, is like giving God a loan. And you know what? God doesn't like to be in debt to anybody. He teaches us not to be in debt. He's not going to be in debt to you for long. He's going to repay that debt. He has infinite resources, right? Psalms 150, he owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, the wealth in every mine. God is going to repay you somehow, some way, and it'll be happening quickly. This is the way God works. As you give, you are lending to me. Jesus said, as you've done it unto the least of these, you've done it unto me. God always identifies with the needy, the less fortunate. And as we give out of our blessing to them, God says, I will see that you are blessed. Malachi 3:10 says the same thing. It's not just a principle in Proverbs, but it's in the prophets here. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. Test me. Now in this, the only place where God says test him is in this area of generosity. And see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there is no room enough to even store. We know about floodgates. Just look at Oroville Dam, when it overflowed. Man, what an abundance of water came down. 2 years ago when we had all that rain, they opened the weir of the Sacramento River and knocked those pieces of wood out, and the Yolo Bud bypass got flooded with like 10 or 15 feet of water. An abundance of water came pouring through, and that's the word here. As we give, God's not just going to replace what we have given, but give us more. Jesus repeats the same principle. Luke 6:38. Give, and it will be given to you, a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be poured into your lap. You see the images of abundance here. For the measure you use, it will be measured to you. It's called the law of the boomerang. It's called the law of reciprocity, that as we give, God is going to replace not only what we give, but even give us a little more. It's the mystery of God's economy. It's God's promise of blessing, that if you give, you will gain. But if you hoard, you will lose. And it is God that is making that math work. It's not anyone but God that can make that work. And this is the lesson for these young, rich teenagers. And it's the lesson for us as well, who have been given so much. Matthew 25:29, Jesus tells the story of these three men that were called in by their master and were given talents, bags of money, and says, now take care of this, and when I return, I'll hold you to account. And the first one goes and doubles his, and the second one goes and doubles his, and the third one, though, he takes it home and he buries it in the backyard. He does nothing with it. And look what happens. When the master comes home, he says, well done, good and faithful servant. Well done, good and faithful servant. But to this one he says, for whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. But whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. And they said, take that guy's stuff and give it to the one who has the most. So the one who tried to hold on to it and not to lose it ended up losing it all. Somehow that's a disturbing thing, that God is the one who is actually going to work against the person who does nothing with what he gives them. That's a hard word. God says if you put yourself out, you start being generous, that God is going to replace it and even bless you more. Why? So that you can give more, right? It's not just to enrich your own life. But he says if you choose to be that monkey and hold on so tight, he says, even what you have will be taken from you. It's one of the biblical reasons for poverty right here in the Bible. Perhaps you saw over the weekend the Lakers game. I did not watch the game. I saw it on the news that at the midcourt during halftime, they got a guy up there to take a shot from midcourt for $100,000, and he made the shot. Did you see that? Can you imagine? In 1 second, He's got $100,000 in his back pocket. I mean, what would you do with it in an instant infusion of wealth like that? And that was exactly my question. I said, what is that guy going to do with $100,000? What is he going to do with it? Is he going to hoard it? Is he going to protect it? What's he going to do? And then I was also thinking about the lottery. I didn't buy lottery tickets this last month, and I don't usually, believe me. But I am tempted every now and again. When it gets up to all these millions, they say, well, you can't win if you don't buy one, you know. The odds are against you, you know that. But the kid was 20 years old in Florida that won the big mega millions. He went home with, what, $250 million. That's after taxes. He's 20 years old. What's going to happen to him? His life is going to change, right? What's going to happen? You know what happens to a lot of lottery winners? Economist Jay Zaworski says in U.S. News and World Report, studies find that instead of getting people out of financial trouble, winning the lottery gets people into more trouble. Since bankruptcy rates soared for lottery winners 3 to 5 years after winning. In just 3 to 5 years, lottery winners don't have it anymore. They haven't learned the mystery of God's economy. They haven't learned how to be generous. They wanted to keep. That's the implication here, isn't it? They say it takes a steady hand to hold a full cup. You want to be tested? Your character wants to be tested? Wealth will do that. Abundance will do that. It's harder to handle than adversity. But here's how. Here's the lesson. It's unnatural. It doesn't make sense mathematically. If we give, we should have less. No. Having more means giving more. And giving more means having more to give. That's the way God's economy works. But you got to start it. God's not going to start it. You have to start the process. As the outflow comes in, God says, I will provide the inflow. So I think you already know this. Successful people manage their money. That's right. They learn how to live on less than they make. We're in a debt society, right? We're in a credit society. Cut those things up, right? Cut those cards up. Invest the difference into savings and give to causes that matter. That's really the challenge, isn't it? To find causes that really help transform human lives instead of just able and create dependence and dysfunction. That is a true challenge today, but we need to do it. Recognize that the affluence you have is not only God's gift to you, but God's means of helping others through you. Blessed to be a blessing. Blessed to be a blessing. If you have wealth, it means obligation, not privilege. If you have wealth, it means service, not leisure. If you have wealth, it means philanthropy, not more consumption. We have enough. We need to share to others. So how can we at ARCC live this out together? Compassionate, caring, inclusive capitalism is what the Bible calls for and what our affluent society finds so devilishly difficult to practice it. So let's show them how. Let's let the church of Jesus Christ be known for their generosity above all things, that we are generous people. So it's not just what we take in, it's what we give out that makes the difference. And I really believe that God will enact this process because we have given that house for a transitional living program. That house we were going to bulldoze. We decided not to bulldoze the house. We are leasing that house for $1 a year. Okay? All right? We are giving to the poor in that situation. And I believe that this process, I think God is smiling because we made that decision. And we gave them some startup money. The money we were going to use to bulldoze the house, $7,000, went to the organization that is going to start that transitional living program there. So we have some skin in the game. And we're not just preaching. We're practicing what we preach. We need to be generous people. And the church itself needs to be generous. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for the sobering word today, but it is an exciting word because you are in charge of the inflow. And if we believe in you, then we got to trust you to supply our needs. Oh God, help us to believe and help us to see the principles of Proverbs and the prophets and of Jesus come true in our own lives. That the way to gain is through giving. And it's not the reason that we give. There is the promise that if you give, there will be gain so that giving can continue. In Jesus' name, amen.